Beware of false prophets, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Matthew 7:15. I think a lot about that saying a lot around this time of year. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. Scary stories, orange and yellow leaves, purple lights, and hot apple cider, candy and chilling winds, jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkin spice everything. It's the one time of year you can dress up and hide who you are underneath masks and makeup. Be whatever you want, and no one knows who you are. I've loved Halloween since I was a kid. As far back as I can remember, my dad always made such a big deal about the holiday. My mother, not so much. They divorced when I was young, and I've always lived between two households. Typically, I'd be at my dad's during the weekends, and my mom's on the weekdays. I'd always pray that Halloween would fall on a weekend so I could be at my dad's house when it happened. He'd always invite my friends over for a big Halloween party. He'd dress up in a scary costume, hand out fun treats, and take me trick-or-treating. My mom, on the other hand, well, she despises the holiday. She's very religious. She's always reading the Bible, lecturing me about this and that. She's got it in her head that Halloween is an evil holiday. She won't have anything to do with it, not even so much as a harvest festival alternative that some of the local churches around us hold. In fact, she doesn't even go to the churches in our town, and we have a ton of them. She never put up jack-o'-lanterns, and not even a hint of fall decor. Not even a be thankful sign for the autumn season or Thanksgiving. My mom is nice enough. She's never been too pushy about her beliefs on me. In fact, she celebrates every other holiday just fine. Christmas, Thanksgiving. She'll even have a beer or two on St. Patrick's Day, but she absolutely has never budged when it comes to Halloween. In fact, she'd make me go to bed really early on Halloween every time I happen to be with her. We've gotten into some very nasty fights over it. I'd be crying and begging her to let me stay up and go trick-or-treating, but she'd always respond that Halloween was evil and that in her house she'd respect the Lord. Then she'd tell me I would just have to get used to it. I once told her I hated her because of it and stormed off to my room, slamming the door. I regret doing that now. I now know she was only trying to protect me. My mom lives several miles away from my dad in a small rural town with about 3,000 people living there. My dad lives in the city, so when I had Halloween at his place, I'd bring back a huge haul of candy because we had so many neighbors. Everyone got into the holiday spirit on my dad's street. In my mom's neighborhood, everyone there did too. So the stark difference between my mom and the town, and mom and my dad, has always been really apparent to me. And up until last year, I just had never understood why my mom was such a prude. When I mentioned it to my dad and asked him to make my mom relent, he'd always say, "Your mom has to do things her way, and I'll do things my way. You just have to respect her wishes, buddy." If you look at the calendar, you'll notice Halloween falls on weekdays way more than it falls on weekends. So sadly, I haven't had the experience of being with my dad on Halloween as much as I'd like. I always noticed how much my mom seemed to dread the holiday. She'd be extra into her Bible, praying. Sometimes she'd come up to me and put her hand on me, closing her eyes in prayer, begging God to protect me. Halloween has always been the same at her house. We'd eat dinner around 4 p.m., then she'd usher me off to bed. She wouldn't tolerate me stepping out of my room, and she'd yell at me to sleep if she heard me staying up. I'd always lay in bed, unhappy and frustrated. I'd hear just outside my door, saying the same prayers over and over again. You might be asking why I didn't just sneak out. Well, I would have, except my mom always had the odd habit of boarding up all of our windows, and even our front and back doors. She'd put up a big sign on the front door that said, "Trick-or-treaters not welcome. At this house we serve Jesus." She'd hang up crosses and sprinkle the whole house with holy water, even line the front entrance with salt. I always figured my mom was just extra paranoid about things, or had gotten it into her head from some televangelist that she needed to be extra scared of spirits and whatnot on Halloween. I've never stayed up very late on Halloween night at my mom's house. with nothing to do but lay in bed as she usually took all of my toys or devices away. I'd usually fall asleep surprisingly easily. I'd dream about what Halloween could have been and try to get over it the next morning on November 1st. It wasn't until last year I finally found out why my mom is so scared of Halloween. Last year, Halloween fell on a Monday. That year was especially hard for me to accept that I'd be spending yet another fun Halloween night sleeping in early, especially since the year before Halloween had fallen on a Sunday and my dad had pulled out all the stops. I dreaded having to spend another year in bed early when for the last 2 years I'd been spoiled with Halloween fun. This year was a bit different. I was 17 now, and I felt I could get away with staying up a bit longer, and at the very least being allowed to watch a scary movie. I got to my mom's house earlier that day, as my dad had gotten me out of high school early. When I arrived, the house was drab and normal. No decor, nothing except for wood beams and piles ready to be nailed up. I hugged my dad goodbye, and he told me to behave myself and just do as my mom said, however upset or unhappy it might make me. Great. Another Halloween puritanically wasted. I went up the steps to our house, said hi to my mom, and hugged her. I asked my mom if this year could be different, if maybe I could stay up and watch scary movies, maybe have some candy. She flat out refused. Absolutely not. Halloween is an evil holiday. You will not have anything to do with it at my house. God help me. I roared with irritation. So unfair. I stomped inside. You're so fucking ridiculous, Mom, I shouted out. I heard her yell about taking the Lord's name in vain. I didn't care. I was so sick of her religious strictness, I needed to get out of the house for a bit. I walked up to the porch where she was standing, apologized for cussing, and asked if I could head down to the store in town for some snacks before we had our early dinner and early bedtime. She sighed. Son, I know you don't understand why I do these things. I know Halloween means so much to you. But it's evil, son. The devil hides in the fun things. Halloween is evil. I wish I could get you to understand. She said it would be okay, but to be home no later than 3 p.m. She was dead serious. I didn't want to find out the fit my mom would have if I didn't stick to her curfew. I walked off towards the main area of town with all the small businesses. My mom luckily didn't live too far from the general store, only 4 or 5 blocks away. I got to the store and was looking at some of the hot Cheetos when a priest came up to me. I glanced over and he said hello. Hi there. Need anything? I asked. I'm sorry to bother you, but I noticed you weren't dressed up, the priest said, his hands clasped in a pious manner. I was supposing perhaps you weren't participating in any of the festivities this evening. I was wondering if perhaps you would like to attend my church's harvest festival party. There'll be candy and even a costume party. I already knew what my mom would say if I asked, so I gently sighed and responded. That's really nice of you, but I actually have other plans tonight, sadly. I'm sorry. The priest smiled and said, that was quite all right. He bid me goodbye and told me he wished the Lord would bless me. He walked off and I took my chips to the register. I walked back home and sulked. My mom wouldn't have ever allowed it, even if it was at a church. She'd say that it was just another form of Halloween and that it was evil and that it was out of the question. I couldn't wait to turn 18 and be out on my own, make my own plans, celebrate Halloween the way I wanted to. I just didn't understand. To me, Halloween wasn't evil or even unchristian for that matter. Sure, it dealt with death and ghosts and ghouls, but it was mostly about fun for me. Costumes, candy, maybe even some sexy times or partying. It wasn't about anything bad. In some ways, Halloween helped us laugh at death. It was the one time of year death wasn't so scary, so horrible. Wasn't there a saying my mom once told me, something like, "Oh death, where is your victory? Oh death, where is your sting?" If anything, Halloween perhaps could help Christians live out that reality. But my mom would never understand that. I went up to the house, trudged in, and ate my snacks while watching my mom start to nail the doors and windows shut. There was no more going out tonight. She was soon done, and the doors and windows were locked. Her sign fluttering on the door, making knocking sounds every time the wind came and hit the wood. Then, she made a quick pasta dinner. I ate it in silence, making it known my displeasure. My mother ate in silence as well, looking at the boarded windows nervously. Then, she checked her watch. It's 4:00 son. Finish up and get to bed. I sighed. I ate as slowly as I could. Every passing moment, my mother seemed to get more and more nervous. I had a few bites left of my meal, but my mom suddenly shot up and shooed me away from the table. That's enough for now. You need to get to your room. Go. I rolled my eyes and walked to my room. My mom closed the door behind me. I looked around my room. I looked at my bedroom window, boarded up with wood. I could see between the slits in the wood. I could see the neighbor's house and the orange and red trees. The sun was still up. I sighed yet again, filled with annoyance. I plopped down on my bed. My mom had taken my phone. There was no TV, no books, nothing to do but try to get to sleep. I stared up at the ceiling in my room. I heard my mother walk up outside my bedroom door, starting to pray. The blood of Jesus protect us tonight. Father God, protect us tonight. Amen. I just couldn't stand it anymore. I furrowed my brow in anger. I was 17, damn it. I wasn't following my mom's lame rules anymore. I made up my mind. Tonight, whether she liked it or not, I was getting up out of my room and doing something Halloween related. I was gonna watch Child's Play or Scream. If I couldn't leave the house, I could at least watch the kids trick or treating nearby. I decided I'd wait until after my mom was done praying and had gone to bed herself to sneak out of my room. I listened to her praying. Jesus, have mercy. Lord, protect us from evil. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us. I lay there, listening to her pray for about an hour. I glanced over at my alarm clock. It was about 6 p.m. by the time she finally finished. I heard her walk off and gently close her bedroom door. I couldn't get out of bed just yet. I needed to wait until I was sure she was asleep. I sat up in bed and looked out of the cracks in between the boards. The sun was rapidly going down. Yet, oddly, there weren't any trick-or-treaters out quite yet. I waited, watching the sky grow ever darker, until I was sure my mom was asleep. It was about 7:45 p.m. The sun was mostly down at this point. Only a slight yellowish glow remained on the horizon. I went up to my bedroom door. I slowly, ever so slowly, turned the knob. I managed to turn it without so much as a sound, and then I gently pulled the door open. It made a slight squeak, and I winced as it did so. Nothing. My mom hadn't heard. Thank God. I pulled open even more, just enough so I could squeeze my body through, and I could get out into the hallway. I did so, and I glanced down the hall at my mom's room. I could hear her gently snoring. I tiptoed to the living room. I went to the couch and sat down, picking up the remote. I turned on the lamp on the side table near me and selected a streaming service on the TV. Scream, Here I Come. I turned the volume down as low as I could. I looked up at the clock on the side of the living room wall. It had just turned 8:00. Some preview for a show I didn't care about was playing when suddenly the power went out. I sat up, confused. The lamp was out. I tried to turn it on again, but nothing. I glanced outside between the gaps in the boards on the window. The street lights were out. Even the lights from the Halloween decor of our neighbors was dark. I watched as the sky grew darker and darker. Perhaps there had been a power surge, but the weather wasn't bad. It had been a perfect, cloudless day. I sat there, perplexed. Then I finally saw something. It was a gentle orange glow. At first, I didn't see what it was. But as I kept looking, I eventually saw a small group of children dressed in Halloween costumes. They held torches in their hands. They had potato sacks to collect candy clutched at their sides. They walked up the street, slowly like zombies. Then another group came. Each of the kids had a mask on. Some were clowns, some were animals, some were skulls or demon faces, but not a single child had their face exposed. Group after group came down the street, silent as the grave. Then I saw more groups. This time, they were made up of what I could only assume were adults. They were far taller and fatter in many cases. Some were holding the hands of little ones. They had masks on too. On had a cartoon cat's mask on. Another had a Guy Fawkes mask. Yet another had what I could only describe as a voodoo mask. They all held torches, lighting their way as the sky finally became devoid of sunlight and pitch black. The torches cast shadows on the neighborhood and the houses, the haunting orange glow reflecting and amplified by the orange of the leaves on the trees and ground. Many people clearly were traveling as families. I saw groups of 5, sometimes 10. Silently, they went up the street. Then I saw one man sum up. He had a special mask on. It was a large black mask with 3 skulls, presumably human, in a triangle formation on the black background. 2 on the bottom, 1 skull on top. He held a torch and an enormous knife with a red hilt. He stopped in the middle of the street and shouted something. Whatever he said, it made the groups of people stop and turn around to face him. He used the hand that had the knife and yelled something, pointing it towards the houses around him. Then, he walked on. He was out of sight, and I wanted a better look at what was going on. I crawled up to the window and pressed my eye against the glass, looking through the gaps in the boards. I could see much more now. The little children had circled back around. They went up to the houses nearby and knocked on the doors. They then stood there waiting for someone to answer. I watched as one of my neighbors, a sweet blonde-haired lady, opened the door with a smile, holding an orange bowl of Snickers. She was about to say something and comment on the kids' costumes, but looked at the kids in wonder. They held their torches and stood there, not even saying the customary trick or treat. The lady laughed nervously and asked if they wanted some candy. "Boy, you guys are really scary. You definitely win that award," she commented, trying to hand one of the kids with a green witch's mask a candy bar. The kid didn't accept it, but instead pointed at her. One of the adults came up to the porch, briskly walking over. The woman's eyes widened and she screamed as the adult roughly took her by arms and dragged her to the street. Her husband came out yelling at the adult to let her go, but 3 other masked adults came out and wrestled him to the ground. They then tied up both people, kicking and screaming. I couldn't believe my eyes. Some of my neighbors looked outside of their doors to see what was happening, only for them to be snatched up next. The children led the way as the adults brought crying and screaming people down the street. I watched on of my neighbors' houses open up, only for a few people I presumed were my neighbors to walk out with masks on, holding their kids' hands behind them, also in masks, to join in the activity. The same thing happened over and over again. The kids would go up to a door, they'd knock and someone would answer. Then they'd be attacked, tied up and dragged away to join others. I watched as they headed towards the direction of the main area of town, where all the shops and businesses were at. I listened as people begged to be let go, men cursing and demanding the reason for all of this. A woman screamed as a masked man got up close to her, grabbed her by the hair and stroked her face with a gloved hand. I watched as more groups of masked people came, dragging teenagers and children with them on a cart. They were all crammed into a cage, some crying, others yelling similar things to the adults. I looked at their wrists and saw they had orange bands. I couldn't read what was on them, but the same symbol as the one found outside on the local Catholic church was on them. More teenagers came, literally by the cartful, crammed into tiny cages with at least a dozen others. I heard wailing and screaming. I watched as they all headed to the main part of town. Then I watched as the children went out into the woods with their parents, leaving the masses of people, about 200 of them, sitting in the street to be watched by the skull man with the knife, and a few other large masked men with other weapons and torches. They struggled against their ties, and the caged youth tried futilely to move. I shuddered as I watched orange lights dive in and out of the trees. The flames on their torches dimmed and flickered in the slight wind outside, making their disappearing sparks look like flashing Halloween lights and will-o'-the-wisps. It was pitch black outside except for the flames. The power was still not back on. As much as I wanted to crawl back into bed, I couldn't tear myself away from the strange events happening outside. I had to keep watching. The children came out of the woods, dragging large branches of wood behind them. They began to pile them up in the center of town until they had built a huge pile of them. A mountain of wood was formed, and then all of the masked people got into a large group in front of the skull man with the knife. The man held his hand up with the knife and handed his torch to a man with a goat mask on. There were so many of them. The skull man spoke. "People, it is that time of year again. All Hallows Eve is upon us once more. Let us remember our commitments. Our Father awaits us. They await us. Let us celebrate." My eyes widened and my heart jumped into my throat upon hearing his voice. His voice was the same as the priest's I had spoken to earlier that day at the grocery store. A cheer rang out from the masked crowd, who clapped their hands. The priest in the skull mask held out his hand, and a man in a gorilla mask brought the blonde neighbor of mine up in front of him. Her face was stained with mascara as she cried, begging, asking what was happening and why they were doing this. The skull-masked man held her by her hair and brought her throat up to his knife. The children in mask went to the front of the crowd and waited expectantly. The priest made a shout and slit the blonde's throat. Immediately blood gushed forth and her screams turned into gurgling. Her warm blood splattered on the ground, and a man in a Michelle Myers mask came up with a golden chalice that had a pentagram on it to collect the blood. Then the man in the skull mask took his knife and began to hack away at the blonde's body. The little kids held out their potato sacks, and the priest dropped pieces of her body into each of them. A bloody lock of hair went into the bag of a girl with a Princess Peach mask, a fingertip into the bag of a boy with an Optimus Prime mask. One girl with a bunny mask on cried with glee as an eyeball was tossed casually into her bag. I watched helpless as she was doled out like some kind of sick treat to the children. I watched as they danced gleefully around the screaming cages of teenagers. The adults went to the great pile of wood and began to pour gasoline on it. One adult in an Iron Man mask lit the pile, and it burst into flames as a great bonfire. The light from the fire was intense, and the air shimmered with heat. My eyes began to well up with tears at the atrocity being committed in front of me. The adults started to drag their tied-up victims towards the fire. Then they lifted them up and tossed them alive onto the blazing pyre. I closed my eyes and covered my ears as they screamed in agony. I started to hear a chant being sung. I peeked up to watch from my window. The goblet of blood was being passed around to the people, who lifted their masks to reveal their lips and to take a sip of the freshly shed blood. The chanting got louder with every person they threw into the flames. They repeated it over and over again. I can still remember the words, "Obscura patris, excepta nostro que innocense sacrificio, sanguis iste nobis, det potestatem, pater mendici, da nobis desideria, cohordis nostris, da nobis omnes gentes dominari, in tentationem potius indugnos." They chanted it over and over again. I wasn't sure how they were even able to chant loud enough to drown out the sounds of screaming people being burned alive. The children danced around the bonfire like demonic imps. I watched as an adult in a medieval plague mask began to look towards my house from far away. He walked away from the group towards my house. I watched as he got closer. 4 blocks away, 3 blocks away, 2 blocks away. Soon he was but 100 feet from my yard. I wanted to hid. I wanted to duck. But I frozen still in horror. Suddenly, someone's hand grabbed me from behind. I let out a scream that was quickly covered by a hand, which silenced me. I looked back. It was my mother. She ducked us both down beneath the window. She went up to my ear and whispered, "What on earth are you doing out of bed?" We both looked up as a shadowy figure got up to the window. The figure stood there, illuminated from behind by the yellow-orange of the town bonfire. We sat there frozen, not saying a word, until the figure slowly moved away from the window. We sat there a while longer until we were sure he was gone. "My son," my mother whispered, "get to bed, and do not get out. Do not look out of the windows. Lay there until sunrise." I got up and did as I was told. I shut my door and got into bed. I tried to ignore the orange glow shining in from my window. I tried to ignore the chants. They had gotten louder. I tried to ignore it when I heard metal being dragged and teenagers screaming blood murder as they were tossed on the fire, trapped together in their metal cage. I tried not to listen as their flesh crackled and popped, and as their screams turned into whimpers. I tried to ignore the laughter of the children most of all. I listened as another person had their throats slit, as adults under masks sipped their blood like wine, like some kind of demented communion. I listened as women moaned and men slammed into them, like the applause of a concert. Their screams of pleasure echoed by the screams of agony. I listened as my mother stood outside my room praying fervently, "The blood of Jesus cover us. The blood of Jesus cover us." I listened as the chants outside turned into one repeated phrase, repeated over and over again. "Ave Satanas, Ave Satanas." I could hear both the young and old chant it. It lasted all night, the same chant over and over again. More screams, more giggling, more sounds of bodies cut up and given to the children as treats. "Ave Satanas, Ave Satanas." Somehow, at some point, I fell asleep. I awoke to my mother on my bed, stroking my face. I asked her if what I saw last night is real. She said yes. Halloween is an evil holiday. I asked many questions. Why did she live here? Why didn't she call the cops? Why did this happen? My mom explained that the town was ran by a satanic cult. She couldn't be sure who was or wasn't a part of it. She had tried to call the cops one year, but without power, they couldn't be reached. And when she reported it to the local police, they had taken her report but had done nothing about it. When she tried another department further away, they didn't believe her report. She had tried to get proof, but no one was willing to see it. They all just thought she was a crazy Christian lady. "Why didn't you warn the neighbors?" I asked, crying. "I did. They didn't believe me," she said, tears flowing from her own eyes. "I knew you'd never believe me either if I had told you. Besides, who wants to tell their child something so terrible?" I asked. Why she didn't keep me with my father every Halloween. She replied that she had to have me on weekends, per court order. That she had told my dad once, but he called her liar. He was too interested in having his own fun every few years, and he insisted I be with her, that she was making it all up. "No one thinks this stuff can happen," she said, "and no one believes people when they see it firsthand." I asked her why she had never moved far from the town to get away. "For one, I'm sure they'd stop me," she said, "and secondly, I cannot abandon the people of this town who don't know. I must warn them. I must do the work of the Lord." I then asked why they didn't come for us. "They would in a heartbeat, but they for some reason will only come for you if you invite them in, if you leave your doors and windows unlocked, if you talk to them, if they see you. I make it clear I'm not celebrating and that they can't come in, and I board the windows so they won't break in. They seem to hate anything to do with the cross, and they aren't too fond of salt." I went out that day after we had taken down the boards. I looked over at the town center. There was no evidence at all of the horrors of last night. They must have cleaned it all up somehow. I would have thought it all a bad nightmare if it wasn't for the distinct char on the asphalt, barely distinguishable unless you knew where to look, and the scraps of potato sack in the bushes around town. I'm 18 this year, a high school senior. This year, Halloween falls on a Tuesday, so I'll be with my mom again. I told my dad I didn't want to go. I told him about what I had seen last year. He yelled at me and called me a liar. He doesn't believe me either. No one new to the town does. We managed to get a few more people to board up their places, but it's not enough to save them all. That's my story. I'm partially writing it to warn all of you reading. Halloween for most people is an innocent, fun, spooky holiday. For some, it's a pagan holiday used to celebrate the dead and to connect to the spirit realm. To a few, it's simply a harvest festival. For others, it's an evil, evil holiday. And you never know who considers it so. You never know who underneath those innocent masks is in fact a ravenous wolf seeking to make you the next sacrifice to untold, incomprehensible, hellish evils. I've got to get going. I gotta help my mother pick up some new wooden boards at Home Depot. Halloween is coming in a week or two, and it's going to be here soon. One last thing before I go. I have a request to ask those of you who are reading. Pray for us. Pray that we will make it through another year of Halloween. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me last Halloween. I have had a very hard time coming to terms with what happened, and I've only been able to trust one other person with my story. He suggested that I tell it here. I brought this up with my psychiatrist several times, and she's written it off as stress-induced acute psychosis. Let me be clear. I have no history of mental illness, although I was struggling with some lingering grief at this time. I am certain that what I witnessed was not a result of this grief. Last year, I took my 2 children trick-or-treating like I do every year on Halloween. Unfortunately, it fell on a Monday, and I had to wait for the kids to get out of school before getting them ready. The day started off dreary, and the misty showers continued into the late afternoon, which was absolutely ideal. When 3:30 came, the kids were excited to get their costumes on and head out. They looked adorable, and their joyous anticipation was contagious. I was absolutely reeling with vicarious excitement. Halloween was always my favorite, and it was pure bliss to hang out with the kids on a spooky, drizzly night. The first 30 minutes or so went as expected, the kids darting from house to house, stopping to show me the variety of candy they had collected. It was good, it was normal. Eventually we ended up at a small house about 2 blocks down from our own. I had seen this particular house many times during my walks, but nothing about it stood out to me. It was a plain, modest-looking yellow house with virtually no lawn decorations or vegetation other than a small lawn and a single maple tree. There was no porch light, and there didn't seem to be any lights on in the house. So, I told the kids we should move on to the next in case the owners were away or didn't want to be bothered. But you know how kids are. It was Halloween, and they were wired for extortion. This house may have had candy, and that was an opportunity they couldn't pass up. I figured it couldn't hurt, but something in my mind told me to walk up to the front door with them instead of hanging back near the sidewalk. They knocked modestly on the door and waited a few moments. As the door creaked open, a small, elderly woman peeked into the opening and gave a light, tired-looking smile. I half expected a terrifying, devious witch, but I was pleasantly surprised to see that she was quite normal. She was probably just not that into Halloween. She placed a couple pieces of candy into the kids' bags and nodded in response to their thanks. I smiled politely, thanking her, and turned to leave when she beckoned me with a curl of her fingers. "Yes, ma'am," I replied and leaned in to hear her. "You have beautiful children, and I know you celebrate in innocent fun. Oh God, she's gonna tell me about the unholy, pagan, occultist blasphemy that is Halloween, I thought. Some of the children out tonight are not really children. I don't know how long I stood in this woman's doorway with what had to have been the most impolite look on my face. I started to ask her if she was referring to older teenagers, because I've heard people complain about that before, and it agitated me a bit, because I'd be collecting candy too if it was socially acceptable. You'll be able to see it if you pay attention. Something will be off. The proportions of the limbs, the sound of the voice. Some of them aren't children. Ma'am, I'm only telling you because one of them is following you, she said, clearly trying to be delicate, but there was haste in her voice. My heart sank. Sure, she was likely declining a bit, cognitively, but her words shot through my veins and left behind an icy suspicion. I felt nauseous, and I had enough of the encounter, so I simply walked away. She's fucking crazy, I muttered to myself. Mommy, you shouldn't curse. My daughter sang, skipping towards the next house. I chose to shake off what the woman had said and continue enjoying the night with my kids. We continued this way, house to house, until I could tell their little feet had grown tired. They started dragging behind me a bit, and I decided to head back towards our house. It was a bit darker than when we started out, and the temperature dropped quite a bit. Now, we had just moved to this neighborhood about 6 months before, and I really prioritized the kids getting the opportunity to make friends. There were a few instances throughout the night that both of them saw other kids from their classes and said hello, or even walked with them to a few houses before going their separate ways. I made polite conversation with their parents and smiled and waved to my kids' friends, but I didn't explicitly remember any names or faces. So, when a boy that looked to be about my son's age called out to him from a couple houses down, I wasn't sure whether we had encountered this kid earlier in the night or not. Aiden, he waved excitedly to my son like second graders do. He looked quite a bit like my son, but lankier, with longer, darker hair. My son waved back shyly, as he always does, and the boy came running awkwardly over to us. Hi, Aiden. I like your Fortnite costume. Aiden looked uncomfortable, but he always kind of did when confronted with unexpected social situations. He thanked the kid and turned to walk in the direction of our house. Are you in Aiden's class? I asked, trying to sound pleasant even though I was dead tired. Oh no, I just see him at recess, he responded excitedly. In hindsight, his gleeful giggling was a little excessive. Okay, well, we're heading home. Are you parents nearby? I asked with genuine concern, since I didn't see many families around anymore. He started nervously. I don't see my dad now, but he must be waiting down that block towards my home. He pointed in the direction we were going. I'll walk with you until we get there, he declared instead of asked. So, we continued walking, the kids chattering among themselves. Well, more so my daughter asking Aiden's recess friend a plethora of questions, and him answering with short answers and frequent giggles that began to sound more and more forced. Aiden looked as uncomfortable as ever, and I realized just how tired my feet were, just how dark it had gotten. The drizzle had stopped, but a mist lingered in the air, making the air heavier. Mommy, what did that lady say to you? At the yellow house, my daughter asked. Nothing, baby. She was complaining about the teenagers. Mommy. Yes. Baby. I was exhausted. My daughter lowered her voice to a whisper. I've never seen him at recess. I don't think Aiden has either. He didn't even know the name of our school. And we've been walking for a very long time. When will we be home? Honey, I checked my phone. How was this the first time I checked my phone? 11:54. Fuck. What the fuck? Mommy, I'm scared. I want to go home. My heart began to race, and my legs turned to jelly. Guys, when did it get so late? I looked at the little boy standing in front of us. His face shifted continuously back and forth, from the excited and nervous smile he had shown me at first, to a solemn and indifferent stare, then to a manic sneer of duper's delight. These expressions kept looping from one to the next, to the last, over and over. I felt it overwhelmingly strenuous to look away, but the sound of fear in my children's voices was enough to sober me for longer stretches of time. I closed my eyes tight, gripping both of their arms tightly. "Aubrey, Mommy's confused. Tell me what's going on. We keep trying to walk and you keep stopping and staring at him. We keep yelling for you to stop. Please, Mommy, I want to go home." With my eyes shut tight and my hands gripping their arms even tighter, I shouted, "What the fuck are you? What do you want?" His voice was shrill and distorted. "Spare 5 minutes more. We're nearly there now. I've gotten to know you so deeply, Catherine." I could feel the vomit rising in my throat, and my chest was on fire. I wasn't confident that my legs could carry me. "Guys, run home, now. I'll follow." My brave and gallant babies obliged. "Don't leave this unfinished. You'll force me to show up again." I ran as fast as I ever had to catch up to the kids and pull them inside our home. I said this at the beginning, and I'll say it again. Almost nobody believes me about this. My kids knew something was wrong with Mommy, and something was off about the boy, but they aren't able to quite put it together, and honestly, neither am I. I'm sharing this because it may save someone's life. I don't know what this entity is, but it looks very much like a child, and it completely removes you from reality. If you encounter a child you don't know on Halloween this year, look for signs that something is off. The limbs, the voice, the demeanor. If anything feels wrong, do not engage. Something was left unfinished that night, and I believe that it's coming back for me. She comes with a mask with no face and knocks on our doors, loudly uttering the quintessential Halloween phrase, "trick or treat." And you've got to hand her candy. If you don't, you die. Nobody knows where she comes from or where she goes. She's always been here, part of the community as long as anyone can remember, and she'll be here long after. There are theories, and where she comes and goes and what she is, but none have ever been proved to be true. There's a fine line between bravery and stupidity, and occasionally you'll have the daredevil teens or the newbie homeowner who wants to know and tries to follow her. Usually they come back, memory erased from the night, or maybe they speak of something horrible beneath the mask, a face like no other. An image so savage and raw, it was enough to drive the insane sane, and the sane insane. A couple years ago, Danforth Davidsman moved in. He was a cruel man who would take any opportunity given to inflict the most evil of things on people. He would call the police on neighbors having a simple drink, or kids having fun. That year, that Halloween, the girl in the mask with no face paid us all a visit, as usual. Danforth didn't listen to our warnings on the girl, though it wasn't like we warned him well, if you know what I mean. Danforth lived across the street, and when the girl knocked on my door screaming, "Trick or treat," I opened the door, and across the street I saw Danforth, arms crossed, a Bible in his hand. He was grunting menacingly and trying to lecture passers-by on the demons of Halloween, and that we were inviting devils into our home. I handed the girl, who oddly never held a bag, a few packets of candy. She giggled and thanked me, just like any other child. "Hey," I began, pointing at the now screaming Danforth. "I heard that man gives really good candy. You should go over there." "Really?" the girl gasped. If she had a face behind her mask, her eyes would have been wide. "That's awesome." I smiled and nodded. The girl wouldn't kill him. It would take more than a simple refusal to kill. At first, there were stages to the effects of the girl. I watched nervously, and the girl in the mask skipped over to my neighbor, an elderly old woman who lovingly handed over 6 packets of candy. I'd heard she tried to follow the girl to wherever she came from many years ago, and since then was terrified of what she had seen. The girl thanked her loudly and finally skipped over to Danforth. It was as if the whole neighborhood collectively held their breath then. We all knew what happened to those who refused the girl candy. Nothing too life-threatening, and we all wanted Danforth's crimes against the community to be paid for. "Trick or treat," the girl laughed. Even across the street, her voice was joyful and loud. Danforth looked at her, quite puzzled. He'd been quite loud in his preaching against the Halloween joy, and was quite stunned when the girl seemed to completely ignore him and loudly scream, now twice, "Trick or treat," at him. "Now listen here, young lady," Danforth began. "Halloween is a creation of evil, and any pure soul must know that." "Trick or treat," the girl once again exclaimed, ignored Danforth's lecture. When Danforth did nothing but continue, the girl skipped away, happy as before, to the next house over. Danforth started to go back to preaching. After a few lines, he stopped. All eyes were really on him now. This wouldn't be something to miss. He began to cough now, and immediately we saw it. Blood. The man coughed again, and more blood erupted. And now, not just blood, but needles. He coughed more violently, and more needles sprang from his throat, scratching him and falling on the floor. It lasted about a minute until he stopped, and then he angrily charged forward, running at the girl. Oh no. He grabbed her by the neck and shook her, violently screaming, "What have you done to me?" and a flurry of curses and prophetic condemnation. The girl didn't respond, only staring up at him with the mask of no face. Danforth shook her more violently, somehow more than before, and asked, "What the devil have you done to me? Take that mask off, young lady. A good girl like." And then he tore off the mask and screamed. I looked away, of course, and to my knowledge, so did anyone else who was watching. I looked into my hands and the bowl of candy I was holding. I heard screaming like I had never seen before, screams that went on, until the scream stopped, and I, although gingerly peered back outside. Danforth was on his knees now, a blank look on his face. He stared into the torn-off mask, now held in his hands. He remained silent, unmoving, and then he collapsed. The girl hopped and skipped away. She had collected her fill for the night, and though old, mean Danforth had torn her mask away, another had emerged, covering her face as the moonlight shone above. She skipped her way off into the distance as we watched, and as she vanished, we breathed a sigh of relief. When I first moved there 6 years ago, I thought it was an elaborate prank and friendly urban legend to spook to kids. I have too. When the girl actually did come, I thought it was part of the prank, and fortunately gave her candy. After Halloween, I asked who had been the cheerful little girl that aligned perfectly with the legend, and to my surprise, they all stayed true to their story. Some of the older people shared stories about the girl, terrible tales, and gradually I was left with no choice but to accept that things were just that way. But before I saw what happened to Danforth, there was always a tinge of doubt in my head. After Danforth, though, did I realize it really was true. Danforth, of course, regained consciousness the next day. He picked himself off the street and returned to his house, confused and still terrified. He made himself small and didn't stop bothering people. At first, the moment Christmas hit, Danforth returned to his old and devilish ways of ringing up the cops whenever some poor soul was too loud for his liking, or if the music they were playing was pissing him off in some way. There wasn't much we could do about him. He was rich and held a mighty sway over the local government. As the months passed and Halloween approached things, Danforth began to grow more crazed. We'd thought he'd finally shut up about Halloween and abide by the legend, but no. Now, Danforth was more vocal against the dangers of Halloween, a full month before Halloween, and he was already speaking out. And not just him now. No, now he had cronies, 2 other Danforth-like copies who echoed anything he said. "We're gonna kill that menace," he shouted, blasting really annoying music as he went door to door, handing out flyers that told us not to feed her candy, claiming that we were giving the devil our souls. "She's going down," one of his like-minded copies echoed. "We're prepared this year," said the other, holding up not one, but 2 Bibles. "Sure," I murmured, slamming the door in their faces. By now, Danforth had heard the legend for himself, and anything he'd choose to do now was entirely going to be his fault. The legend tells us that the first visit is only a warning. Fail to appease the spirit of the girl, and you disappear. She takes you with her and you go away, never to return or to be seen again. And there's no escaping her either. I took the kids and me away on vacation a Halloween once. Lame, I know. And she was there, knocking on my hotel door. Trick or treat, and fortunately, I was prepared, handing over a protein bar I'd completely forgotten was in my bag. She looked at it, puzzled, but skipped away and vanished. Nothing bad happened to me, and since that night, I was always prepared. Halloween season was really rolling in now, and Danforth and his cronies had begun to take down decorations, much to the cries of innocent children. We couldn't wait until Halloween, then that weirdo would have his words worth. At last, did Halloween finally roll in. "Trick or treat," I heard, as knocks that were far too heavy pounded on the door. I practically leaped over and opened the door, seeing the girl once more, a mask with no face still being worn, although a thin, almost smile had now emerged. "Here you go," I cheered, handing her an especially large grouping of candy. The girl was practically bouncing with joy, and it was clearly not because of the candy. "Why are you so happy today?" "Today I get more treats," she replied, jumping up and down for joy. And now, in a more, almost adult tone, "More treats than I've ever had before. More treats that will bring peace and justice back to our community." "What?" I began, but by then she was off, skipping away, but then being ambushed by Danforth and his cronies. "You devil," he called out, stopping the girl in her tracks. His cronies surrounded her. "I order thee to leave our holy community." One of his cronies began to chant something. I was too far away to hear. The other had both Bibles up and was waving them around. It wasn't really very clear. "In the name of all that is good and holy, I banish thee," Danforth growled, reaching for the mask and preparing to rip it off. "I reveal to the Lord the face of a devil. May he destroy you and bring peace to our fine land." I was too captivated to look away as Danforth ripped the mask off the girl's face, revealing her true identity, a face off of nothing, an endless void. And yet there were shapes that didn't quite make sense. I didn't see her face in full. No, just from the sides, and I quickly averted my eyes, fearing the impossible geometric shapes that riddled her face. Danforth's cronies screamed as they saw whatever else was in that void, and they began to run. One of them tripped in the sidewalk, and tripped, yet impossibly being thrown backwards, right into Danforth's house, shattering the windows. The other suddenly stopped in place mid-run, and I don't really have any words to explain what exactly happened to him. He froze in place and began to float just ever so slightly off the ground, and he went up and up, slowly gaining speed, until he was never seen again. And Danforth, well, whatever happened to him was clearly worse than the others. He began to throw up now, but not needles, rather packets and packets of candies, all empty. He began to choke, and yet more fell out. The girl reached down on the ground and picked up her mask, putting it back onto her face. Danforth stopped vomited candy wrappers and looked back at the girl, who then placed her arms upon his shoulders and whispered something. Danforth's eyes bulged in horror, and then they were gone. His eyes. They became candy wrappers that fell to the ground, floating away in the wind. The rest of him followed soon after, until he exploded in hundreds of orange and black candy wrappers that drifted away under the gaze of the moon. and the little girl, happy as ever, skipped into the horizon. Now, as I finish typing this up, I hear that familiar sound of a knock on the door, and those perfectly timed words, trick or treat. Things are good now, without Danforth. We all pay our dues to the girl in the mask, and not a single soul has been harmed since. So if you ever see a little girl in a mask that had no face, do give her some candy. She really does appreciate it. Trying to pick something out for All Hallows, are we? The old man asked in his gruff, though oddly mellifluous voice. Orville's old-fashioned oddity outlet was infamous throughout the city of Sombermory and Harrowick County beyond. Everything he sold came with a story, and every story was complete and utter bunkum. Most people thought that his shop was just a tourist trap to capitalize on our area's plethora of urban legends, and that it was only the runoff business from the much more popular Eve's Eden of Esoterica across the street that kept him afloat. But for those willing to entertain the notion that an elderly snake oil salesman in a pastel suit and straw fedora might in fact be a legitimate purveyor of the preternatural, Orville's little shop was worth hitting up. I had ventured in there in the hopes of finding something that might gain me admittance to an upscale Halloween party that I was most definitely not invited to, and a wall filled with gorgeous Masquerade masks had stolen my attention. "Ah, yeah, I'm trying to put together a Halloween costume," I said to the old man. "These are beautiful. What can you tell me about them?" "Tell me, miss, have you ever heard tell of the masked city of Incognata?" Orville replied, his voice dropping melodramatically, as if he was trusting me with some coveted secret. "Somewhere out amidst the plains, in the void between worlds, there's a void that's a world unto itself. A sovereign city-state that follows no laws but its own, and that includes the laws of physics. It's a city of eternal masquerade, where the citizens are forbidden to remove their masks for any reason, under punishment of exile. Some say it's because the Incognati slowly became their masks over time, either unintentionally or to save themselves from the growing madness of their home. Either way, their identities and souls now live entirely within their masks, their bodies reduced to mere hosts. These are the masks of exiled or fallen Incognati, ripped willingly or not from their bearers, leaving the masks silent and the bodies screaming and jabbering in incoherent madness. What became of those bodies, I don't know and don't care to ask, but the masks have been lovingly safeguarded, passed from buyer to buyer and wearer to wearer, wandering down many different paths before all winding up at my shop. Should you choose to don one, the ancient and arcane knowledge held within will begin to trickle into your mind, but so will the identity held by the mask. You won't lose yourself to it all at once. It will be far more insidious. It will take over so gradually that you won't even realize it's happening. Go incognito long enough, and you will become incognati. "I see," I said with an amused smirk, ignoring the fact that you just blatantly ripped that story off of the SCP Wiki. "You're saying that if I were to try on one of these masks and feel absolutely nothing, that would merely be the insidiousness of the curse, and not evidence to the mundanity of the masks. Won't matter to me then, honey. You wear it, you bought it." Orville chuckled. "If you don't mind my prying, what's got you in the market for such a high-end Halloweeny mask, anywho?" I was hoping to get into Seneca Chamberlain's Halloween party," I admitted with some hesitation. "He hasn't had a party this big in years, either because of COVID or some personal issues he was having. Since there will be so many people there, I was hoping that if I just looked the part, I might be able to sneak in unnoticed. I'm not going to steal anything or hurt anyone or blow anything up. I just want to crash the party. Pendragon Manor is the stuff of legends. I'd love to see it from the inside, especially on Halloween. Crash Seneca's big Halloween bash? Yeah, I can get behind that," Orville chuckled. "None of these masks will do the trick for you, though. Not if I know Seneca's security, which, incidentally, I do. They need to attend some sort of sensitivity training about the appropriate manner to deal with the ornery elderly. He fetched a keyring from his desk and used it to unlock a drawer directly beneath the mask display. He slowly pulled it open, revealing a silver mask sitting on a velvet pillow. It had been constructed of tightly meshed wires, woven into mesmerizing fractal patterns. Though the wires were slightly less dense around the eyes, the mask was completely lacking in any facial features whatsoever. This, young lady, is 100% Sealy silver, made for an incognate Marchioness, he said, as he held it up, glimmering like a spider's web in the early morning light. You may have heard that the Sealy have a bit of a knack for names and the like. This mask hides not only your face, but the name that goes with it. Wear this to Seneca's shindig, and I guarantee you'll get in. He pushed it towards me, and I gingerly accepted it. I turned it over in my hands, running my fingers along its cool silver filaments, gazing in awe at the ethereal designs they formed. The mask certainly seemed, if not otherworldly, then at least extraordinary. It was inconceivable to me that it was merely some sweatshop-produced chrome costume that he was trying to pawn off on me. Okay, maybe not inconceivable, but a remote possibility nevertheless. So now fairies made these masks? I asked incredulously. No, just that one. Pay attention. You think mortal craftsmanship would ever be good enough for a Marchioness? He asked. Uh-huh. And of course I wear it, I buy it, so I can't just try it on to see if it actually does what you say it will. I sighed, shoving it back towards him. I might as well buy a can of magic beans. Now hold on. Maybe we can work out an arrangement, he said, refusing to accept the mask. You said you only wanted it for Seneca's Halloween party, right? Well, what if in exchange for a small security deposit, just enough to cover the deductible on my insurance in case you don't bring it back, I'll let you use this mask for Halloween and bring it back the next day. If it does the trick, then perhaps you'll be interested in buying it for keeps. If not, then you get your security deposit back. Potential big scores for both of us at minimal risk. What could possibly go wrong? I paused, pulling the mask back as I considered the offer. Magic or not, it was absolutely stunning, and probably my only hope of getting into the party. Just a small safety deposit? I asked. I'll even throw in those magic beans to sweeten the deal, he said, his wide grin revealing fillings made with the same Sealy silver as the mask. $1,000 safety deposit for a Halloween mask. I must be out of my mind, I murmured to myself as I drove up the winding terrace that encircled Pendragon Hill. It wasn't really that outrageous of a sum, considering how much I had spent on my hair, gown, jewelry, which included a tiara, and shoes. All told, I'd spent an awful lot of money on a party I wasn't even invited to. The only traditional expense I had forgone was makeup, since if the mask worked as advertised, I wouldn't be able to take it off. As I approached the top of the hill, I could hear the faint sound of live music, and I saw the fancy cars lined up at the titanium gates as a stout little valet checked to make sure they were on the list. I quickly grabbed my mask and fastened it to my head. It didn't really impair my vision that much, but it certainly wasn't anything I had wanted to wear while driving up a hill where one wrong turn would mean disaster. As I pulled up to the valet, he glared down at me and my vehicle with palpable contempt. "Are you on the list?" he asked impatiently, looking like he was just waiting for an official reason to call security. "I don't need to be on the list, Woodbead," I replied with an indignance that took me off guard, and I hadn't the slightest idea where the name Woodbead had come from. To my surprise and relief, a look of sudden regret washed across the valet's face. "Yes, of course. My apologies. I didn't recognize you in your marvelous new vessel," he said. "Welcome to Pendragon Manor. Please enjoy the party." "Thank you," I said, smiling mischievously beneath my mask as I pulled into the motor court. I wasn't 100% sure if the mask had actually worked, or if I just happened to resemble and sound like someone the valet knew. And at that point, I honestly didn't care. I was in. I felt like I was in a fairy tale as I hoisted up the skirts of my gown to ascend the tapering staircase into Chamberlain's mansion, passing through the front foyer with nary a glance, and straight into the majestic ballroom. The floor was covered in mosaics of gleaming marble tiles, lit by crystal chandeliers hanging from a ceiling embellished with Renaissance-style frescoes. Guests in elegant evening wear and masquerade masks danced to classical music from a small chamber orchestra performing on a stage at the opposite end of the ballroom. Portraits and statues lined the walls. An open skylight revealed the starry firmament above, and the floor-to-ceiling arch windows afforded a whimsical view of the aviary outside. As starstruck as I was by the venue, I still managed to spot Chamberlain mingling with the other guests almost immediately. He was easily recognizable despite his golden Oni mask, tall and slender in a three-piece crimson suit and top hat. I saw him cock his head slightly when he noted my presence, excusing himself from his other guests to come say hello. It had originally been my plan to avoid him as much as possible, but as he approached, I was inexplicably free of any fear that he was coming to confront me for attending his party uninvited. "Come to hold me to my standing invitation, I see," he asked wryly. "I would have come sooner if I had had any legs to stand on," I replied, before I even knew what I was saying. "Is Crowley here? I'd love to say hello." Lamentably, he was unable to attend this evening. Something came up in Adderwood that he needed to see to, he said, as if I had the slightest idea of what he was talking about. "Oh, really? What about that noir woman I've heard about? Is she there as well?" I asked, uttering yet another name that meant nothing to me. "It was her idea, as far as I can tell," he shrugged. "So then, there's no one over your head here tonight?" I asked. "No one who might object if you took an old friend down to the old tunnels beneath your wine cellar? And here, I had hoped that you'd simply come to take advantage of my hospitality," Chamberlain laughed. "But if you're looking to make a discreet exit from Sombermory, I believe I can arrange that. After the party, however, I'm not about to abandon all my guests when they've been so looking forward to seeing me again. I suggest enjoying yourself until then. If not for you, then for your chauffeur. It's the least you could do for making her bring you all this way." I laughed, though I didn't know why, and Seneca left to attend to his other guests. For the next few hours, I mingled with my fellow revelers. A few of them I knew by reputation, but most of Chamberlain's friends fell under the category of reclusive, eccentric millionaires, and I had never seen or heard of any of them. None of them ever suspected that I didn't belong there, in no small part because I always seemed to know exactly what to say. Unfamiliar words and foreign names dropped from my mouth quite regularly, their meaning known only to their recipients. It became increasingly hard to deny that it wasn't me who was speaking, but the mask that was speaking through me. While this admittedly made me uneasy, it wasn't enough to make me want to take the mask off. After all, hadn't this been exactly what I had wanted it for? It gave me the identity I needed to get into the party, and of course, that identity had come with some baggage of its own. It wasn't actually controlling me or taking over me, I thought. Throughout the night, I had been able to take sips of cocktails or bites of hors d'oeuvres Mandalorian style, lifting up the mask just enough to slip something into my mouth, and I felt no resistance from the mask when I did this. I remained convinced that I remained in full control of my actions and could take the mask off anytime I wanted. It wasn't until the hour neared midnight that something went amiss. The sound of a struggle drew my and everyone else's attention towards the door to the foyer, revealing an unwelcome latecomer. He was tall, spindly, and shabbily dressed in a faded and tattered orange suit. His jack-o'-lantern eye mask was clearly a cheap mass-market costume piece, marking him as painfully out of place amongst such a high couture crowd. We all would have been wondering why they had even let him in. were it not for the several security guards who were frantically trying to pull him back. Despite his slight frame, the man seemed to possess an inordinate strength and continued his advance through the ballroom with very little difficulty. "Where is it? Where is it?" he shouted in a raspy, nearly inhuman-sounding voice. The old man said it would be here. One of the security guards tasered him, and he didn't even flinch. He just batted the weapon away with a casual backhand, craning his long neck across the sea of masks, as if trying to find one in particular, and then he stopped when his gaze fell upon me, effortlessly tossing off the security guards, who had barely even managed to slow him down in the first place. He burst into a sprint as he dashed towards me. I started running too, of course, but instead of running outside as I logically should have, I ran into the kitchen. Despite having never been in that room before, I went straight for a door that ended up leading down into a wine cellar. It occurred to me that maybe I was there to hide or use the wine bottles as weapons. But I didn't stop. I kept right on running towards a cask of Amontillado at the back. Before I could reach it, I felt long and slender fingers grabbing me by the back of my gown and hoisting me into the air. "Well, don't you look radiant this evening?" the jack-o'-lantern masked man asked mockingly as he spun me around and dangled me in front of him. His teeth were stained nearly the same color as his suit, his stubble thick and uneven upon his rectangular jaw, and his jaundiced eyes protruded so far from their sockets, I was sure they were about to fall out. I struggled and kicked, but his grip was like iron, and his sunken chest was like granite. "Thought you could escape our collection by running off through the cuniculi. You'd only have wasted both of our time. There's nowhere you can go in all the worlds that I won't be able to find you." He grabbed the mask and pulled it from my face as hard as he could. It didn't want to go, and I was afraid he'd tear the skin off my face before he'd get the mask off. With every inch he pulled it out, I felt something inside me, something inside my head, being pulled out with it. I screamed in agony when he finally ripped the mask from my face, barely even noticing that he had dropped me to the ground. He held the mask high above him in triumph, gloatingly staring straight into its faceless visage. He tossed aside the cask of Amontillado with his free hand, revealing a hidden iron door. He easily tore it open and descended down a dark flight of stairs just as the security guards caught up with us. A couple of them chased after him, but two more remained in the room, and I realized that they were flanking Seneca. I looked up to see him gazing down at me with the same sort of disdain one might show for a moldy piece of fruit that was no longer of any use to anyone. "Get this interloper off my property," he ordered with a sad shake of his head. "You miserable old bastard!" I cursed at Orville the next morning. "You knew what that mask was?" "Of course I did. I told you what it was. What are we yelling for?" he shouted back. "You knew it wanted to use me to get away from here, and you knew someone else was after it," I cried. "Lady, look at the front door. What does it say?" he asked. "It says caveat emptor. It means buyer beware, and it applies to everything I sell here." "I didn't buy it. I just put a safety deposit down on it," I shouted. "I only wanted it for one night, and it probably would have used me until I dropped dead. And then you told that crazy jack-o'-lantern face guy where I was. I could have been killed." "Hey, he said the old man said you'd be there. You can't prove he was talking about me. There are lots of old men he could have been talking about," Orville insisted, but then let out an uneasy sigh. "Look, I'm sorry. What do you want from me?" "I want my safety deposit back," I told him. "Absolutely out of the question. No return, no deposit. Them's the bricks," he shouted. "You made that agreement without ever expecting to see me again, and I wouldn't have lost the mask if you hadn't ratted me out to the jack-o'-lantern guy. That's maleficence, and it voids our agreement," I said. "Maleficence. Maleficence. Of all the dirty, rotten, underhanded things I've been accused of over the years, no one's ever accused me of maleficence," he claimed. "I admit to no wrongdoing, and since returning your deposit would now be a tacit admission of guilt, I ain't giving it back. However, in the interest of de-escalation, I'd be willing to let you take $1,000 worth of clearance merchandise out of here. before taxes and fees and service charges. The only things you have on clearance are more of those magic beans, and the jar you gave me was expired," I shouted. "Not expired. Past their best before date," Orville corrected me. "You can still use them, they just, well, let's just say I'd recommend planting them rather than eating them. Better they be coming up through your backyard than out your back door, if you catch my meaning."